The topic we chose for our final presentation was people of lower socioeconomic status. We conducted a survey asking people in our community about any stereotypes they may have about individuals of lower socioeconomic status, as well as the media's portrayal of such individuals.
Our first survey question was, what are some of the traits that you typically associate with someone when you think of an individual of lower socioeconomic status? The top answers included drug and alcohol use, poor work ethic, and violent or stealing, as seen in this chart. It is a common misconception that poor people tend to abuse drugs and alcohol. In reality, drug use is distributed equally across all social classes. For example, some studies have actually found that upper middle class white high school students had higher alcohol consumption than lower class African American students.
So typically when you think of someone who falls under the lower socioeconomic status category, any stereotypes come to mind for you?
Right, so I was thinking more about when I was growing up, because now that I'm more aware of the stereotypes, I was remembering, and my parents are from the Philippines, so just remember I'm a child of immigrant parents, and my parents had education when they came to the US. So whatever stereotypes I had about lower people that were from the lower socioeconomic status were ones that I learned from my parents. Interestingly, I think one of the things I do remember when I was growing up was when we somehow, the image that comes across to me is the panhandler, the beggar, someone on the street, someone who's asking for money. And I think panhandler, I thought that was a really interesting word, because I think, gosh, I haven't heard that word in a long time, but I remember my father using that word. And I guess panhandling has this long history, but basically it just means, someone begging on the streets.
So going off of that a little bit, now that you've grown up, you're in this career, are there any misconceptions that you think other people that you've heard?
Yeah. One thing that, as someone who's in education, I think that poverty is just as invisible, is more invisible than race. Race you can see color, but poverty isn't. And so I think some of the misconceptions that people have is that when you're poor, people blame the person who's poor. They think that person brought that person's responsible for their condition, and therefore they're the only ones who can pick themselves up, pick themselves up by the bootstrap. And so they're responsible for their condition, they didn't work hard enough. Other misconceptions is they must be wasting, they must be drug abusers, they must be doing something that's dark, that's not enabling them to get a job. There must be a reason for why they're not able to hold down a job and make money. Other misconceptions might be poor people just keep having children and not able to take care of themselves.
It is also a myth that people of lower socioeconomic status are unmotivated and have weak work ethics. Research has found that 2/3 of people living in poverty work an average of 1.7 jobs, and 83% of children in low-income situations have at least one working parent. Lower socioeconomic status adults spend more hours working weekly than those who are wealthier. For those that don't work, there are many factors that contribute to their lack of employment. While many people assume the poor are more likely to steal, research has found that the rich are actually more likely to cheat on taxes, cheat on romantic partners, and more likely to shoplift.
The next question we asked was, are any of the following races one you would typically associate with people of lower socioeconomic status? The majority of people associated being Latinx or African American with being of lower SES, as shown in this chart. While poverty affects people of all races, multidimensional poverty is more common for minority groups. A 2014 study found that in the US, 39% of African American children and adolescents and 33% of Latinx children and adolescents lived in poverty. Lower socioeconomic status was the least common among Asian children and adolescents. Our survey results also found that no one associated Native Americans with lower SES, but American Indian families are more likely to live in poverty than Caucasian families.
Okay, so moving on a little bit. In your studies, do you see any connection between lower SES and immigrant families?
Yeah, I do in some. So it's interesting because my colleague and I, Shauna Haynes and I, actually work with families who have refugee experiences. So right here in Vermont, we have a large immigrant population, but we also have a really large refugee population, new American refugee population. And something that we notice when we work with families is that the SES of these families really vary depending on what kind of educational and employment experience they brought from their own country. So for example, we had interviewed a group of Syrians. Now there were 3 Syrian families that we interviewed all in one weekend. And we couldn't have imagined more differences, bigger differences. One of the families, the father was a banker in his own country. The mother was a professor. Mm-hmm. So the children, when we met them, the children just had all of the literacy, just sort of, you could tell they had the education and the schooling. And then compare that with another family that we interviewed, and the father was a baker, and the mother stayed at home and didn't have a job. And the schooling was a little bit sketchy. They couldn't afford to send their children to private school, and so they came. And so their ability to find a job that would help them make just enough to survive in the place where they live now in Vermont is different than from the other family that had more resources. Even though the father, the banker in the one family, left his job behind, mm-hmm. he still had the resources and the knowledge to figure out where he could access certain resources and then build himself up, while the mother, who's a professor, used her skills to get into their children's schools. And so you can see what I'm saying is that depending on the background that they had, they varied. And so from a historical perspective, many there are differences in the different immigrant groups. For example, in the U.S., the Mexican immigrant group has a lower, generally has lower SES than possibly other immigrant groups that came from India or came from China. Mm-hmm. See, and so the same thing with refugee. And then if you any of the research is being documented, we may not be sure, but we already have learned about that. And if you're undocumented, it'd be really hard to try to get jobs without social security right. numbers, and what kind of higher paying jobs. Actually, it was really interesting. I know this doesn't have to do with immigrant, but at the same time, remember we talked about the intersection of Black and immigrant, mm-hmm. or immigrant groups who are common, who are Black. Mm-hmm. Just today, the news came out that even though we see a wage increase in general over in employment, in all employment sectors across the U.S., the ones who are benefiting the least by about just 1.2% increase is the Black group, as opposed to whites, Latinx, and Asians, who have gained much more from the wage increase. And so what they were calling for was just this federal increase in pay wage, in minimum wage, that would help actually some of the Blacks in the southern states who have much lower wages.
We also asked the community, is there an age group that you would typically associate with lower SES or homelessness? Most people responded that they associate lower SES with ages 18 to 30 and 30 to 50. No one selected under 18 as an age they associate with lower SES. In reality, many children are living in low-income families and poverty today, and it has a long-lasting impact. Research has proven poverty to being the biggest threat to children's well-being and impacts their ability to learn and contributes to poor physical and mental health, as well as low self-esteem. The younger and longer a child is in poverty, the greater the risk.
So focus on the children a little more. Have you seen any impact on whether their family has a positive or any positive or negative impact on their family's standing in the country?
Yeah. So this is all qualitative. This is just what I noticed. Mm-hmm. This is all qualitative, but in all the families that we've interviewed, and we interview the children as well, we interview the children, the parents, and the teachers, something that I noticed with the children right away, and I'll just talk about secondary education because I've been in the high school lately, is that many of the new American refugee families, their children want so much to be consumerist, just like their white counterparts. Yeah. They want the right, the shoes, the phone, the iPhone, and their parents can't afford it. And so if there was an impact, I would say the impact is sort of the stressors around wanting to belong but not having the gear that everyone else does, or the clothes, maybe where you, being able to eat out, that sort of thing. Now, at the same time, I see a conflict where parents from other countries are trying to teach their children about the values that they had, or just sort of like the expectation, like, no, we can't afford that, or you're going to have to work, you're going to have to leave school early to work. So sometimes I see kids that have to help support their families financially, and the kids have to stop their education.
Yeah.
Or, you know, so that's another, and again, these are just qualitative stories. And yet it's just so different, and they do it to help support their family, you know, because they want their family to survive, and so it's interesting. But there is.
To find out about the media portrayals of low SES, we asked people, are there any shows that you can think of that focus or highlight individuals in a lower SES? The top answer was Shameless. Other answers include news stories highlighting the struggles for low-income families, medical shows such as New Amsterdam and Grey's Anatomy, and dramas such as This Is Us and The Fosters.
Yeah. So then a little more focused on like the course that we're taking is representations in the media. So are there any representations that you can think of that represent individuals in a lower socioeconomic status, whether it's in TV shows, movies?
Yeah, I just think that every kind of representation by the media is inaccurate. Well, let's take news, for example. News can only get one part of the story at all, and as someone who has a background in journalism, the news will always be controlled by whoever's in charge of it, whoever owns it. And so if you only have a specific certain group of people that own the media, they will only be, unfortunately, they will be depicting probably that perspective. And so I think whenever we see anything about poverty in the news, I can only see like black criminals, jail, unwed black mothers who have children, drug abusers, or poor, white, mostly rural poverty. That's what I see in the news.
In the news, yes.
And so there's never, I think the problem with that is that kind of representation just doesn't tell you the whole story. I'm also thinking about, you know how there's also the horrible juxtaposition between blacks in different socioeconomic statuses. For example, in our class we've talked about wealthy rappers, black rappers, you know, Beyonce, people who make it in the film industry, and maybe there's some actors, but that's just like a really marginal, really small representation of poverty that blacks make, and blacks make up the smaller population than we think in the U.S., you know?
Yeah.
So.
In our research, we found that most people do not associate the elderly with lower socioeconomic status. However, in 2014, 10% of people over the age of 65 were living in poverty. There are many factors that contribute to this, one of which is high medical bills for illness, disease, and injury. As we learned in class, dementia is the 6th leading cause of death, and it is extremely expensive to find care for someone with dementia. 58% of people with dementia live in low or middle income countries. Not only does being lower income make finding care for someone with dementia harder, but it also increases the chance of getting it. A 2018 study found that among older adults, the most financially deprived were 50% more likely to develop dementia.
The final survey question was, of the media examples you listed above, do you think they portray individuals of lower SES in a positive or negative light? 83.3% of responses were negative, compared to only 16.7% positive. This is not a surprise. Media tends to use inaccurate portrayals of individuals of marginalized groups, which results in misconceptions. In the case of those who are homeless and impoverished, media depictions are often unrealistic and negative. People of lower SES are often represented as villains, beggars, helpless, and immoral loners. Characteristics including loose morals, drunkenness, and criminality are also common, and African Americans and women are disproportionately portrayed as poor people.
And other stereotypes that come to mind is, when I think of lower SES, I do think stereotypes can represent different races, different ethnic groups. You use the term immigrant, refugee status. but I also, there are stereotypes of rural white poverty and black, black neighborhoods. And so those are the stereotypes that come to mind. And so these are just some of the misconceptions. There are others that I was thinking poverty is often associated to drug abuse, drug trafficking, mostly black. They're all dependent on welfare, the welfare system. Poor rural white farmers, black fathers, or those sorts of stereotypes, often overhyped with criminality.
So you would say that they're inaccurate representations, and then you would also say that they kind of highlight individuals of lower SES in a negative light?
I just haven't seen any portrayals that are accurate except in documentaries.
Okay.
Maybe documentaries, and possibly in some really well-meaning sitcoms, maybe, that are produced, and maybe movies that are produced by the very people from those communities, might be able to give a much wider perspective of the stories of that group.
Do you think that the media has a large impact on people's viewpoint of lower SES? And do you think that there's anything that the media can do to change people's opinions or the negative stereotypes?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, absolutely. I think ever since we're young, any kind of media, social media, watching TV, watching streaming, yes, totally. And I think it really does shape the way we think about poverty. It's a lower socioeconomic status, and combining that with implicit bias, it actually helps to form implicit bias, I think is just a recipe for disaster, for, just sort of, we will always have distorted perspectives of the other. And so I think one way in which they can improve, I think they can totally improve. And I think that's just gaining more perspective, maybe doing something different, creating documentaries, maybe asking, I've seen documentaries of people who live in those very neighborhoods that the media depicts as poor. And I know that the National Public NPR or PBS had done this in the past, I think it was 30 years ago. They gave audio recording set to some equipment to a group of black teenagers, and they said, hey, go and interview yourselves, interview your family, tell the world who you are. And they lived in some of the worst, what everyone referred to as projects, Chicago housing projects. And they, these two boys, Lee Allen Lloyd, I'm remembering one of the two boys' names. They went ahead and interviewed, and became this whole big book and documentary.
Oh, wow.
And that really helped people. Teachers were able to use that and teach their students about what it means to live in these neighborhoods, what's life like, because it wasn't just stories of poverty and miserable lives, but it was also a story about families and love, and the love that families have. And it really humanized them rather than objectify them, which is what often happens in media.
I think one of the reasons that we chose this topic for our project is because I have a very strong personal connection to working with individuals in a lower socioeconomic status. For a lot of my high school career, I volunteered at a local Boys and Girls Club not too far from my house. My partnership with them started as a coat drive that I organized. Something that really struck me was that most of the students that came through their program didn't own a winter coat, and I knew that something needed to be done about it. When I went to the facility and handed out the donated coats at the Christmas party that they have every year, I saw all the kids' glowing faces, and I knew that I needed to be more involved. The Boys and Girls Club keeps these kids, whose parents work long hours, out of trouble and off the streets. It gives them something to do after school, and I wanted to give them something exciting to look forward to. So I decided to start a dance program for the 4th and 5th graders that spent their afternoons at the facility. I taught to a group of 20 boys and 5 girls. Working with these kids was so rewarding. Most of them, although at first they were forced to be there, loved the class. It was amazing to see them learning and picking up what I was teaching. I went once a week, and the connections that I formed with these students were amazing. They were all smart and kind and seemed to have really bright futures. I won't lie though. I certainly went in with some kind of common stereotypes, even though I knew that I would be working with kids.
I found that most of the students were Black and had very little. However, I was also expecting to see a lot of students who did not care about school or didn't want to work hard, or some who were even rude or judgmental. I was very wrong about this. These students were so inspiring. I would sit in on some of their homework time, and they worked so hard. They were polite and eager to learn and participate in what the Boys and Girls Club had to offer that day. This is an experience I wouldn't change. I worked hard, and it was a struggle to keep them focused sometimes, but that's just because they were kids. It had nothing to do with their social standings. They were just people that wanted access to after-school programs and to be involved in their community, and I commend the Boys and Girls Club for providing such a safe place for the youth across the country.
So you've clearly had some experience working with individuals of lower SES. Would you mind just sharing a little bit of like the impact that it's had on you personally? And did it change like your view of individuals of lower SES from when you were growing up?
Gosh, yeah. Yeah, this is something that I have really, I've had difficulty with growing up, only because I felt like I had a lot of privilege in my life. My parents were from the Philippines, and I would say my mother came from a working class background, but she had education. And what I mean by working class, her family were often police or military or naval, and my father's father did not have an education, but he was really smart, and they lived in a small town, and the father acted as the lawyer, even though he didn't have a college degree. He just happened to know how to get paperwork, stand up in front of a court and, persuade the judges. So he did that, but his father died at an early age, so my father he had to really take care of the family, and he had 2 younger sisters and a mother. And it was during World War II, and they lived in the Philippines, and so, the Philippines had been colonized by Japan and the Japanese. And I'm just giving that story to say, my father was struggling, but the one difference is that his father had accumulated land. Mm-hmm. And so then my father was able to sell off the property and then to make his way over to the US so he could get an education. So then my father worked really hard, he became a physician, but I do remember them counting pennies, mm-hmm. because they had to build up their own financial background, and then they wanted so much for their children, and so I feel like I benefited so much from them. But what's so interesting is perception. So growing up, I think the things that really were so strange to me was that when I would make friends, I think some of my friends perceived me as working class, mm-hmm. or lower. It was really interesting. And then when they came to my house and saw the cars that we had or saw the house that we lived in, I felt that I remember 2 incidents where they were super angry. They were really angry. And then finally, being young, being in my early 20s, I had no idea why they were angry. I thought, wow. What? But then one of them said, "You never told me you lived in a nice house." And I said, "Wow, what does that mean?" And then she just cut off our friendship. This was someone that I met in the university. And then I began to unpack it a little more, and I said, does my physical, does the way that I look have an impression on people in the way that they stereotype me? Remember we were talking about double consciousness? Mm-hmm. Because I never thought about it in that way, I just thought, wow, I'm a lucky kid, I get to go to school, I have a lot of privilege. But the way that some people perceive me, I was thinking, oh, that's why they felt so comfortable around me. Maybe it wasn't the color, maybe they just thought that I was a very comfortable person to be with, but they didn't have a lot, and when they came to my house, it shocked them that I had a lot more than they did. So it's a very strange story, but it's something I think about a lot. I wonder how much SES, how that relates to your physical attributes and what people perceive of you if they only meet you for the first time. It's something that I wrestle with because I also had that layer, that ethnicity and race to think about. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but it's also impacted me in knowing that even though I teach a course about race, I also know that it's powerfully interwoven with socioeconomic status. You cannot separate the two, and how important it is for us to be thinking of of dismantling, you know, all kinds of systemic injustices and oppressions, any kind of system. And it has to do with power, and people in power have a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an important topic that I think in the universe, I'm so glad that you're talking about this topic because it is something we need to focus on that people don't know a lot about.